The Chicago World's Fair of 1893, buildings that housed every delight you could imagine. Beautiful statues graced opulent grounds. Venetian-style canals curved around perfectly manicured open spaces. Spectacular views could be seen both during the day and even at night, thanks to the newly installed electric light powered by Westinghouse's generators. But the greatest attraction lay just a short walk down the Midway. Towering above all of the buildings, the steel observation wheel granted a bird's-eye view of the Chicago skyline. Designed by George Washington Gale Ferris, Jr., the structure stood approximately 264 feet above the ground and carried 36 fully enclosed gondolas, which could hold up to 40 passengers each. The wheel itself weighed over 1,300 tons and cost over $385,000 to build. The idea behind creating such a spectacular attraction, like the observation wheel, came at the behest of Daniel H. Burnham. Now, he was the lead designer for the Chicago World's Fair, which was also known as the Columbian Exposition. And he wanted something to rival the Eiffel Tower, which was unveiled in 1889 at the World's Fair held in Paris. He wanted something original and that would wow the crowds and make them remember his World's Fair over everyone else's. But what about the man behind the design? George Washington Gale Ferris, Jr. was born in Galesburg, Illinois on Valentine's Day, 1859. He was one of 10 children born to George Washington Gale Ferris, Sr. and his wife Martha. Now, the Ferrises lived on their dairy farm until about 1864, when they sold it and moved to Carson City. And George Jr. was about 5 years old at the time. Now, George Sr. was a horticulturalist and made a lot of different landscaping improvements to Carson City during their tenure there. But George Jr. really wouldn't follow in his footsteps. The family left Nevada in 1875 and moved to California, where George Jr. attended the California Military Academy and graduated a year later. He then went off to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and graduated in 1881 with a civil engineering degree. Now, it was his engineering skills that would help set him up for his next phase in life. Now, like Andrew Carnegie, Ferris began his career with the railroad and had special interest in bridge building. In 1885, he established the G.W.G. Ferris and Company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as inspection engineers for industrial sites. He also designed bridges and trusses, etc. He then founded the Ferris-Kaufman Company, which did large-scale construction projects like major bridges in Ohio, and had branches in Chicago and New York. And it was these endeavors which helped create his fortune. In 1891, he met Daniel Burnham at a banquet, and this is where Burnham issued his challenge. Now, because he wanted something better than the Eiffel Tower, the actual French architect said he would come and build a bigger tower for him. But Burnham said no. He wanted it to show the result of real American genius. So, while he's making this, Ferris remembers his love of a water wheel he had seen in Carson City. Grabs a paper napkin, sketches out a design, and looks at Burnham and goes, "What do you think?" Well, Burnham wasn't really all that impressed because it looked like it would collapse. He then showed it to some of the other engineers and they agreed, but Ferris would not be deterred. He went and spent $25,000 of his own money to create blueprints for this design. Now, we know that the wheel was a success, both domestically and internationally, and was one of the highlights of the World's Fair. But there was a fatal flaw, not in the design and not in the construction, but in the financing of this wheel. Many of the directors of the Chicago World's Fair believed that Ferris's idea was just too bizarre. They thought he was a lunatic, thought that this design, if it did stand up, was actually going to eventually crash or not withstand the winds that happened in Chicago. and somebody was going to get hurt. So they told him he had to finance his own project. And Ferris, because he believed in this idea, started a joint stock company and got the financial backing he needed to create his dream. Now, people paid 50 cents to ride the observation wheel. In over 19 weeks, more than 1 million people rode that wheel, which brought the estimated value of the revenue to $725,000 in 19 weeks. Unfortunately, George Ferris wouldn't see any of these profits. He had to sue to try to get some of the reimbursement of the profits that he was denied from the observation wheel. But during the same time, there was a patent lawsuit against him. Now, while his observation wheel was the first made of steel, there was somebody else who actually held the patent, and his was created out of wood. Now, William Summers was creating his roundabout and erecting different 50-foot wooden wheels in Asbury Park, Atlantic City, and Coney Island. And because of the patent lawsuits against him and the lawsuits that he had against the Columbian Exposition, Ferris had to declare bankruptcy and lost all of his companies. Shortly after that, his wife left him. After the end of the Chicago World's Fair, Ferris had the wheel dismantled and reassembled near Lincoln Park, and he reorganized his Ferris Wheel Company in hopes of developing a new amusement park. And he opened up the Ferris Wheel Park in the spring of 1896, but the surrounding community didn't want it. They felt that it was an eyesore, and they successfully blocked him from getting a liquor license. That and other economic issues would lead to the park closing in 1903. But Ferris would never see the park close because he died of typhoid fever on November 22nd, 1896, just a few short months after the park opened. He was cremated, but his ashes remained uncollected for over a year until one of his brothers could satisfy the funeral debt. And it's amazing how he went from a farm beginning to having wonderful success and money with the peak of the career with the observation wheel, and then losing everything because of that same wheel. Unlike other men who created vast empires, Ferris died penniless, yet his name lives on. Today, you can find Ferris wheels at carnivals, amusement parks, and even major cities around the globe. These include the Melbourne Star Observation Wheel in Australia, the London Eye in the United Kingdom, Singapore Flyer in China, the Dubai Eye in the United Arab Emirates. But it seems only fitting that the world's largest observation wheel can be found in the same state where George spent a good portion of his childhood, Nevada. Standing at over 550 feet tall, the High Roller was built in 2014 and carries on the legacy of George Washington Gale Ferris.